I'm Carina Yepez. I was born here in Chicago, born and raised. I'm first generation. My parents are from a small town in Guanajuato, Mexico, right in the heart of the country. And I begin my presentation by honoring my grandfather, who was the first one to migrate to the United States. He came here through the Bracero program, which is an amnesty program that was allowing people from Mexico to the United States to work the farms, because this was during World War II, where everyone was being sent off. I worked at the National Museum of Mexican Art, and I'll get into that a little bit, but my grandfather, along with hundreds of people who were braceros, were interviewed by the Smithsonian Institute, and he has an interview at this link here, which, if you're interested, the stories are heavy, they're loaded. My grandfather specifically, I learned in this moment that I had to ask him to please come and be interviewed. He didn't want to be, he had shame. And he was the last person to walk through the doors, and someone was really kind and said, because you work here, we'll interview him. And he was sprayed with pesticides, and he had to be stripped down his clothing, first chemical, like firsthand experience, right? So just one of the examples, I found this image recently. Today, he's 97 years old, so I'm just really grateful that if it weren't for my grandfather, I wouldn't be here. In addition to him, thank you. He's this handsome man right there. The middle here, yes, the middle, yep. And because of that work and labor that he did in the fields, he found support. He found a community that he learned. He loved the land. He loved preserving it. He loved taking care of it. And he was able to go back home many years later and purchase his own land. And so this is a quilt that I made in 2018. It's based off of a photograph that I took. I started my artistic practice with photography in high school. And so this is one of the first quilts that I make to honor him, while also telling his legacy and reminding him on a daily basis of how thankful and grateful I am for him. My first teacher, I like to say, in my artistic practice is my uncle, Carina Yepez, who took these photographs. Here we have a visual of the concrete being poured into the town. On the left side, you can still see the dirt in that left corner, and on the right side is that main road that was built in my lifetime. I remember playing in that land, playing with that dirt and loving it, because growing up in the streets of Chicago, there wasn't a lot of access to this for me, right? The alley were my backyard. So, it was great, but we couldn't go further than that. It hurts when you fall on concrete. This is the road we would travel when we would visit home, when we would visit my grandparents. I was very fortunate to travel to Mexico a lot during my summers, and it was a 36-hour drive. And there was a lot of us in the car. Back then, it was like we didn't really wear seatbelts. And I'm one of 6 children, and it was just like the experience of being in community with my cousins and my aunties, and the neighbor was gonna go with us, and they were gonna get off, in another state, right? Or we were gonna cross the border together because we needed to do that together. And so we would stop for gas, and we would stop for bathroom breaks and food, but my dad would drive through, like straight shot. So this really shapes me, right? And being with my grandmother, because my relationship with my mom, I'll get into a little bit further, but coming back to a lot of the conversation around vulnerability, right, is something that I'll get into. But my grandmother for me was like my light, my todo, my everything, right? And so being with her was just like happy moments. This is my community. This is my community that I start with, and then I start building upon it. These are my siblings. One of my brothers is in a mental institution who was diagnosed with schizophrenia, very rare type, depression, during a very critical time in his life, and so this also shapes me, right? Growing up and seeing him navigate sensitivity and a lot of different moments in my life. I love this picture because I do look kind of cute in the middle there. And and I like how my brothers are all wearing sports shirts because it's their assimilation to Chicago, right? It's how they want to belong to this culture, to this society. And my mom's curtains are in the background as well. So getting into fiber arts and the process of making is such an important tool for me since a really young age. The curiosity of touch, of my hands, of something that I can feel, something that protects me, keeps me warm. And noticing these things helps me explore the trauma. There was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was on a medication, and because of low access to mental health back then, they took away all his medication, and he was in an accident and tried with homicide, and incarcerated for 3 years, and this was what really affects me. And so trying to release the trauma from my body, not knowing, because I didn't have anybody telling me, I just really felt it in my body. I wanted to get it out. I wanted to process. I wanted to navigate this. I do a 200-hour yoga certification program, and then I do a 10-day silent meditation course through the Vipassana program, and that also helps me open up to that moment of art and life and art, right? How the arts helps me trust the process, how the arts help me release and surrender, how the arts help me listen and be a slow looker, how the arts are shaping this. And so this posture here, for example, is a heart opener. And so in the painting, you have the representation, what looks like a heart, right? And through visual thinking strategies, which are some tools that I also use with a lot of people, not just young people, but adults as well, right? It's just who my audience is. Like, we all have a language through visual, right? And so, but we're not given that access to that. We're being it's being taken from us, right? As our stories are erased, as we are not highlighted as a people that, you know, we're not to be depicted in paintings in museums and institutions, correct? Well, not correct, but that was my version of it. Exploring books that I would go to the back of the books and textbooks and look for Mexico and like, where's my story, right? Where do I belong in here? Like, Chicago, Mexico, what? Like, who am I? And my grandmother always helped me navigate those conversations, right? My grandmother told me about where she grew up and how she grew up in scarcity, and how gratitude and food was something that we didn't take for granted, right? How love and community was something we didn't take for granted. In this way, I explore the female and male energy in me, and how I was exploring relationships that were very confusing for me at the time, of processing grief and love and heartbreak. And so this helps me open up into my own quilting practice. I'm waking up at, my grandmother passes away in 2018, and I also leave the museum at this time, so I'm navigating a lot of grief. And I'm waking up at 4 a.m. just really moved and inspired to create. And this is one of the pieces I did during this time, and it's really the beginning of that outlet for me and how I ended up here, and I'm still like processing that as I share this presentation. And I want to go back to the National Museum of Mexican Art because my time there was when I started at 19 years old, and I started as a tour guide, a temporary tour guide for Dia de los Muertos exhibitions, for Day of the Dead. And so I didn't know of this tradition because my grandmother would say it was for pagan. It was a pagan holiday. And I would say, but grandma, like, I want to go visit. I know I'm going to need this when you're gone. Like, I was thinking ahead. I was like, I know I'm going to need these tools. I want to make an altar for you. And she would say, no, 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 no. And we would have discussions about it. I was like, but please, can we go give your mom food? I knew her mom was kind of like a vulnerable moment where I could maybe tap into. And she would say no. And she's like, my mom would do that, but I'm not doing that. Well, this holiday reminds me of, the three parts of our death as I learned it, right? The first part of our death is when our body stops, our brain and our heart stop. The second part is where we become one with the earth. So we're either cremated or buried. And then the third part is when we are forgotten, right? And so the idea of this holiday through earth, fire, wind, and water, and these elements that are used in indigenous practices and Catholicism, that we honor our loved ones with these tools as a way to remember and heal ourselves, right? And the idea that we're facing death, right? We're not running from it because it's inevitable. And instead, we're having this fun with it. We're eating, we're celebrating the life that we do have. And so this helped me really shape that, right, process for me, because I had already gone through so much grief. My mom's mom passed away when I was 6 years old. My friend had passed away. And so loss in Chicago was also very real. And seeing my mom go through loss and not having the tools to navigate this, but just really believing in faith, right? Like just really having a lot of faith and not having the tools to process was something that I really questioned. And so with this celebration, I was given a task to help out with a big community event. And I was like, I want to activate the museum. I want to activate the museum as a space where it becomes the altar as a symbol. And so we did that through opening up an open call for anyone who wanted to participate and make an ofrenda in the back of the museum, in the turf area. And we had over 100 submissions. We only had space for 100, but on that day when we counted, we had 140 altars because people just were showing up and wanted to honor and celebrate together. And it was really moving for me, as it was the first event that we did, and it was really, really special. My cousin had passed away the year before at 38 years old in her sleep. And she was an icon. She was like the first one to graduate college in women's studies. How amazing. And she would call me on, I would call her on my drive home from Northeastern, an hour from my house at the time. And she would always pick up that phone call and talk to me on the phone. And it was really special that I was able to have this way to process and grieve. I cultivated the celebration as best as I could, as it would be done in Mexico, because the research and the spirituality of it and the artistic platform for me was really important that we maintain. So I worked with community schools to create these mojigangas, these puppets that you see here. The moms helped make the dresses, and it was really, really beautiful, really great how everyone was coming together from all over the city. Well, a lot of people all over the city will say that, but the people that contributed to building the festival were from the south and west side of the city. Towards the end of the event, people who didn't make their altar started leaving food and spirits for their loved ones who didn't get a chance to celebrate their loved ones with an altar. But it just reminds me of the community of grieving and solidarity that we have and responsibility that we also have to do this together. Through this project, I'm very moved because when my grandmother passes away, I start reflecting on how I'm stuck in my practice. My paternal grandmother passes away, and her body is no longer with me. And I start thinking about my maternal grandmother who passed away and didn't have like the process of grieving that we did for my paternal grandmother, because on the morning of my paternal grandmother's funeral, burial, we were gonna bury her here in Chicago, and all of her grandchildren were really upset because we knew she wanted to be home. And my grandfather was grieving. My aunties and uncles were like, we want her here. And all the grandchildren, she had a lot, maybe 30, were like, we were really upset. But the morning of, my grandfather wakes up and he's like, we need to take her home. What was I thinking? And so her process of grieving together as a family ended up being about 2 weeks, much like she would have loved it and deserved. And I thought my mom's mom didn't get this. Like, she didn't have this, and I was a kid, and I couldn't help my mom through this. And so I started exploring and asking questions about my maternal grandmother to learn that she was an amazing seamstress. And I do remember sitting at her sewing machine, this very one, and just hearing like the rhythm, the movement of the machine, like, and it was so therapeutic for me. And so I go to her home in Mexico, and I start taking out covers. I start opening drawers, to find the tools that were hers, thinking about, was she the last person who threaded that machine? Were her hands on here? When? How? And my mom starts looking, my uncles start looking and start thinking like, oh, this is real art now you're making, right? We can connect to this. So thinking about the fabric and the material that women have carried through storytelling and through making that has not been identified. Now we're seeing more of this conversation, but not identified as a fine art, but seen as a craft and domestic use. And what does that conversation bring up for me, right? Because for me, it was curated for a home that when the man was in the United States working, the woman was also creating this legacy and lift and support, and this matriarch was holding all of this, right? So also honoring my grandmother for her work and her hands, right? So all of this becomes a really big conversation for me, honoring the textiles and the collection that keep us warm, that give us a space that feels safe. And if we're lucky to have something like this, right? And so I look in her closet, and I'm looking at her collection, and looking at the things that she's kept since she was started, her life as a homemaker, and then the things that she had that my aunties were bringing from the United States. And so this is my maternal grandmother's work that I found in her drawers, made with her hand. And just learning about that, I was like, wow, she was an artist, right? And thinking about the practices that I was given from my mom, but also the practices that I didn't learn, like weaving, because weaving is a practice that was not really taught to me in the center of Mexico because of colonialism. And so thinking about this, I start wanting to think about the weave, because weaving is very, very intricate, and it's really difficult. And so for me, it was like start from the beginning, and this is a work that I did while I was in grad school, when I applied in 2018 when my grandmother passed, and then I was there from 2019 to 2021. And this is an example for me of the Chicago experience and the Mexico experience. This is both my paternal grandmother's services. This is the work, the altars that I create in my home. So when my grandmother passes and I'm starting to make, my friend owns a flower shop, and she calls me and says, "Are you interested in showcasing your work at my flower shop?" And I was like, yes, absolutely. But I was heartbroken because my grandmother wasn't going to be there. And so this is the first time that I print on fabric, and I was like, I want her presence there. I want her there. And I had a lot of my family come over and help me cut flowers, so we could then put them on her piece. So in this way too, I make a halo around her, because at her funeral, my cousins and I were laughing afterwards, because so many people were coming up to us, and they were like, "Oh, your grandmother, she was my best friend." And we're like, "Whoa, I never met you, great." And then my cousins were like, "Did you know, this person came up to me and said, 'Wow, your grandmother, she was my best friend.'" And I was like, "Wow, she had a lot of best friends." And we all started sharing these stories, and so many people were saying that about her. And then her grandchildren were like, "But I thought I was her best friend." And that was the type of person that she was. She made everybody feel seen and heard and valued and loved, right? Like, she was just a big warm hug. And so this is, since I mentioned, like, this is the first time that I print on fabric, and it becomes a really monumental moment for me as an artist, because from there, I start creating these other moments of remembrances and spaces of creating this altar-like form in museums. And so this piece here was at the National Museum of Mexican Art, and thinking about landscapes and spaces as first generations, like, you hear this a lot: you're not from here, you're not from there. But in this current day, I'm starting to embrace, actually, I'm from there and I'm from here, right? Like, this identity of belonging rather than not feeling like I belong, right? And changing that mindset for myself. And what these landscapes give us and provide for us with the warmth, with the earth, with the all of that. I went back after grad school to teach to the women that I was in the quilting group with. And so I was doing research about this garment. It's called the keshkemil. And I knew it as la mañanita. And when I was in class, someone told me, la mañanita, no, that's not a mañanita, that's a poncho. And I was like, well, okay. I never heard it as a poncho. I just always heard it as a mañanita. It's like this triangular shape. And my professor was like, amazing. Look into it, So that was my research, was to look into this garment. And as I started to uncover what this garment was, it was depicted as a symbol of resistance because it was depicted on women in hieroglyphics and women that were depicted as goddesses. So as I'm exploring, and there was the keshkemil in Nahuatl language, right, which is a neck garment. And so thinking about this like multi-language of mañanita, poncho, keshkemil, right, I started to understand like the power and resilience of this garment. So I went back to the quilting group that I was in while I was at the museum, and I gave this class so they can depict themselves as goddesses, and how would they make this keshkemil as a representation of themselves through color, through pattern, and the stories that they want to share about themselves. This is me, working in community, and I tend to just be like, I'm going to give a class. You want to come? Whether you registered or not for it, because of the power of creating together is really, really important. This is Mama Kemba. Mama Kemba I met in 2019. Who, when my grandmother passed away and there was the protests were happening because of the killing of George Floyd, I started thinking about how I honored women who had passed, and I was like, wow, Mama Kemba deserves to be honored while she's living. She's a performer. She texts me every single morning an affirmation quote. I call her my spiritual grandmother. She calls me her spiritual granddaughter, because she said to me that no one had ever honored her in such a way of seeing herself depicted in this way on quilting. A story that she really resonated with was the story of Ida B. Wells, which they have a lot of things in common, and doing the investigation of the Chicago stories through the Chicago race riots. If you're not familiar with them, we can talk about those later, but just thinking about the stories that embrace a city and an experience, and why the segregation, why the violence, why the gatekeeping, right? And through this work as well with the Chicago race riots, and I tap into my work at Firebird Community Arts. If you're not familiar with Firebird, it's a glass studio in the west side of the city, in East Garfield Park, and we work with young people that have been impacted by community violence. And there's a poem that always moved me when I was in high school. It's called I Am Joaquin by Corky Gonzalez. It talks about history of Chicano, Spanish, Indigenous. And so I always read it like since then, and every time like new things came up for me. So I presented this poem to the youth at Firebird Community Arts, and I gave them the prompt to write it as if they were Eugene Williams, the young boy who passed away in the Lake Michigan while he was swimming on a hot summer day. So I'm going to read this to you all, and each line it was written by either a student, a trauma intervention specialist, or a teacher at Firebird Community Arts. I am Eugene, born in Georgia, raised in Chicago, swimming on a hot summer day on Lake Michigan. I am the color of my skin. I am my ancestors. I am independent. I am mother. I'm a walking testimony. I am entrepreneur. I am happy. I am a genuine person. I am a friend and an artist. I am alone with my thoughts. I was birthed from water. I am a blessing and an intelligent young man. I am a golden child. I am brother. I am understanding, and I am who I am. I am son. I am brother. I am an artist. I am full of wonder. I am who I surround myself with. I am searching. I am Eugene Williams. And this is now at the Corning Museum of Glass in their permanent collection. And if you haven't had the chance to know Firebird, I highly encourage it. Fire is really a good tool for our young people who have lived through so much lived experience to be able to confront this very fearful moment with fire, right? And so through this process of understanding, respecting, trusting, accepting, they are glassmakers. And the final slide in my presentation will share a little bit more about that. But also just the importance for me, how everything that is living is worth mentioning and noticing and reflecting upon. For example, as we navigate overpopulation and these two animals in the suburbs, we're faced with this conversation around how we're invading somebody else's space, and how, for me, this erasure of our history, my history, and my background is this conversation that deserves to be highlighted. And so that's what's happening in Oak Park and River Forest, is that they're killing the deer because they're overpopulating. Through my work in living under patriarchal norms and lack of vulnerability in a lot of my upbringing and machismo culture, I explore this idea of crying and blooming, because the flower to me is something that needs water, and it's a rose that also has a thorn. So llorando y floreando is crying and blooming. Understanding that in order for us to release, if we release, we have the opportunity to grow, right? And so this is something that I actually made during our current president's first term, while also reflecting on the men around me in my life who I love dearly but really struggle with this notion. Continuing with these affirmations for myself of self-love, self-care. What does that look like when it's not like a face mask, right? With respect, with boundaries, healthy boundaries, especially working with young people impacted by community violence. You know, we often, we talk about that, wanting to help people, but are we doing it in a way that is actually mindful for what their needs are, right? And so thinking about that and understanding the things I tell myself too, like, hey, you're wonderful and powerful too, right? Because I didn't grow up hearing those words. It's something I needed to tell myself, and something that I tell my students now, right? That really just goes such a long way. It's like building up that confidence. These are pieces that I made. So I made one, the one on the left side, I made two of these. So the one on the right side is my grandmother in her home in Mexico. And then on the left side, I try to do during her birthday, I try to bring her back out into my family's lives, and just kind of this way of talking about her for the grandchildren to know who they are, the great-grandchildren to also know who they are. And my nephew, who's 2, walks into my home, and she lives in my home. And every time he walks into my home, he's like, hi, Mami Cheva, because it's so important that we continue that conversation around her practices and who she was. This is a piece that was actually at the Art Institute not too long ago. It was in an exhibition on loss and absence, and I love learning from elders and wisdom. There's so much there for me. And something I bring back to the communities that I work with is not only do our hands hold, these memories, but also the stories do, right? And so I went to Amalia's home, who's seated right in the center here. And I went to her home and I was like, oh, Amalia, she was an elder in the town. One of the last elders, actually, she was the last elder living at the time, from the photograph as well. And she's like, oh my gosh, Carina, I found this photograph. I know you're going to love it because it has to do with textiles. And I was like, tell me more. And then she's like, these are the women that used to gather in the town and sew together. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. This is like my whole practice. And then I saw my grandmother was in there, and she's the young girl, and she was just telling me about it. And with this piece, I had my auntie and my mom sew and mend the photograph where it was ripped, because my auntie and my mom were the firstborn, the first women in the family that my grandmother had, and their regiment was to wake up at 4 a.m, do their chores, sew, go to school, come home and do more chores, sew again, and then start the day all over the next day. And so they were disciplined in this way, and so it just, at this moment, I'm thinking about me. Like, I have a full-time job. I'm a practicing artist. From that image, they sent me this image from the town, and this is the image from a follow-up of the sewing machines, which I thought was really fascinating, because this one, they were all hand sewing together, community coming together. And then someone from the town saw that picture at the museum and said, look what I found. Now they have the sewing machine. And this piece is permanently in Austria, in Vienna, in a museum there. Now I'm exploring other legacies and other stories that are not just the ones that I knew and I've researched. This is a family from Indiana who have a similar story of migration. I've done another story of a family from China, Mei story that I didn't include in the slides here, but it is also at the Pueblo Unido Gallery. We have a solo show there, so you can see these pieces in person. This is my great-grandmother, a tiny woman, but a mighty woman who had a very difficult life with domestic abuse and scarcity. And here she is as a representation of power and florals in my city. This is current work of me as my first self-portrait. During the time that my brother was incarcerated, I took this photograph, thinking back at her and having these conversations of myself as reflection. I constantly look at, maybe pictures of me. I'm in that picture, in that piece too. I'm a young girl painting in kindergarten, and then it's a photograph of myself from my passport photo. But having these conversations with myself of like, who am I? What would I tell that girl now? And how proud I am of her. And this is my most recent work. It's my glass flowers, my glass curtain that I made with 3 young people at Firebird Community Arts and a couple of artists. Each student made 25 flowers each, and I had them, it's just thinking about the beaded curtains that are dividing spaces as a young child, thinking about glass as the glass ceiling, thinking about these borders that are presented to us, thinking about so many things in here. And that's my Firebird crew. Some of the coaching that I've done at Firebird when I arrived was meeting them where they were at. There was skills that I knew that I had that I could share with them if they wanted them. And so they showed up and they wanted them. And I'm super proud of who they are today. And the work is still an ongoing journey. Like, it doesn't end, as we know. And I'm really thankful to Kevin, who has always given us the platform to speak with them and also present their work to the community here.